Shalom, shalom, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in. It's your sister Shaya here, back again, reading the last chapter of the book, The Creation of the Patriarchy. Ready to get on to the next thing, trying to um, get things done before moving on to the next one. So, we're going to go ahead and finish up this book before moving on to the next book. So, this chapter is titled Symbols. Western civilization rests upon the foundation of the moral and religious ideas expressed in the Bible and the philosophy and science developed in classical Greece. We have shown in the preceding chapters how, in the historic period, when humankind made a qualitative leap forward in its ability to conceptualize large symbol systems which explain the world and the universe, women were already so greatly disadvantaged that they were excluded from participation in this important cultural advance. To understand the implications of this fact fully, we need to consider for a moment the importance of the creation of symbols. Humans, like animals, preserve themselves, propagate the species, and create shelter for themselves and their offspring. Unlike animals, human beings invent tools, alter the environment, speculate about their own mortality, and make mental constructs to explain the meaning of their existence and their relationship to the systems. Homo sapiens becomes truly human. Eric Fromm says human beings are half animal and half symbolic. Ernst Becker explains men, man has a symbolic identity that brings him sharply out of nature. He is a symbolic self, a creature with a name, a life history. He is a creator with a mind that soars out to speculate about atoms and infinity, who can place himself imaginatively at a point in space and contemplate bemusedly his own planet. Yet at the same time, man is a worm and food for worms. His body is material. That is alien to him in many ways. The strangest and most repugnant being that it aches and bleeds and will decay and die. Man is literally split in two. Man or male has found a way of dealing with this existential dilemma by assigning symbol making power to himself and life, death, nature, finiteness to woman. Becker comments that by this split, man seeks to control the mysterious processes of nature as they manifest themselves within his own body. The body cannot be allowed to have ascendancy over him. Above all, human beings are concerned with immortality. The desire to survive one's own death has been the single most important force compelling humans to record the past and preserve it. History making is the process by which human beings record, interpret, and reinterpret the past in order to hand it down to future generations. To do so became possible only after people learned how to manipulate symbols. The development took place in Mesopotamia with the invention of writing, circa 3100 BC. The development of a symbolic system of number notation preceded the invention of writing. Both of these advances were made in the course of business and trade activities. We have shown how these activities centered in the temples and in the courts, and how the ruling elites in establishing class society appropriated to themselves the control of the symbol system. Class society, I have argued, began with the dominance of men over women and developed into the dominance of some men over other men and over all women. Thus, the very process of class formation incorporated an already pre existing condition of male dominance over women and marginalized women in the formation of symbol systems. Yet, as we have seen, the older systems of religious and metaphysical explanations persisted for centuries, and in those systems, women had their share of representation and symbolic power. The exclusion of women from the creation of symbol systems became fully institutionalized only with the development of monotheism. Hebrew monotheism conceptualized a universe created by a single force, God's will. The source of creativity then was the invisible, ineffable God. He created male and female in a significantly different way out of different substance, though each enlivened by his divine breath. He covenanted and contracted only with males. Circumcision, as the symbol of the covenant, expressed that reality. Only males could mediate between God and humans. This was symbolically expressed in the all male priesthood, the various ways of excluding women from the most essential and meaningful religious ritual, their exclusion from the formation of the minyan, their segregated seating in the temple, their exclusion as active participants from the temple service, etc. Women were denied equal access to religious learning and the priesthood, and thereby they were denied the capacity of interpreting and altering the religious belief system. We have seen how procreativity and creativity were severed in the creation of monotheism. God's blessing of man's seed, which would be planted in the passive receptacle of woman's womb, symbolically defined gender relations under patriarchy. And in the story of the fall, woman and more specifically female sexuality became the symbol of human weakness and the source of evil. Jewish monotheism and Christianity, which built upon it, gave man a purpose and meaning in life by setting each life within a larger divine plan which unfolded so as to lead man from the fall to redemption, from mortality to immortality, from fallen man to the Messiah. Thus, in the Bible, we see the development of the first philosophy of history. Human life is given meaning through its unfolding in the historical context, which context is defined as the carrying out of God's purpose and God's will. Man, endowed with free will and instructed by holy right, as interpreted through male priests, could actively fulfill his destiny and affect the historical process. Men interpret God's word, men carry out the ritual, which symbolically ties the human community to God. Women's access to the purpose of God's will and to the unfolding of history is possible only through the mediation of men. Thus, according to the Bible, it is men who live and move in history. In the 6th and 5th centuries BC, historical scholarship of a secular nature developed and flourished in Greece. With the writings of Thucydides and Herodotus, the recording and interpretation of history became separated from religious thought, as did science and philosophy. But the construct of history was a male product and would so remain for another 2,500 years. The major definitions of gender symbols in the Old Testament had been completed by the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC. Although we cannot deal with developments in Greece of the same period in any detail, it is important for us to look briefly at the development of Greek thought and philosophy, which forms the second root of the idea system of Western civilization. I will omit from consideration the third important symbol system, science, and its origin in Near Eastern and Greek thought, because it falls beyond the scope of this work and is beyond my capacity and training. But it is worth noting in passing that science also developed in such a way that women were not included in the community of participants and creators, even though there were a few exceptional female practitioners in mathematics in antiquity. As was the case in Mesopotamia and Israel, Greece of the 8th through the 5th century BC was a class society with slavery, and it was a thoroughly patriarchal society. Although there has been some historiographical controversy over the degree of the domestic enclosure of respectable women and the separate spheres in which men and women lived, the fact of women's legal and social subordination is undisputed. Women in Athens were excluded from participation in the political life of the city and were legally lifelong minors under the guardianship of a male. Let me read that again. Women in Athens were excluded from participation in the political life of the city and were legally lifelong minors under the guardianship of a male. The common practice of men in their 30s marrying girls in their teens reinforced male dominance in marriage. Women were severely restricted in their economic rights, but those of the wealthier classes were somewhat protected in marriage by the provision that their dowries reverted to their natal families in case of divorce. The main function of wives was to produce male heirs and to supervise their husbands' households. Many female children were exposed at birth and left to die, with the decision over their fate always made by the father. Premarital and marital chastity were strictly enforced on women, but their husbands were free to enjoy sexual gratification from lower class women, her- herderae, and slaves, and from young men. Respectable women spent most of their life indoors, while men of their class spent most of their time in public places. The major exception to the domestic confinement of middle class women was their participation in religious festivals and cults and their attendance at weddings and funerals. Greek society developed the polis, the city state surrounded by independent farms and governed by magistrates and laws, to its highest form. In the Archaic period, 7th and 6th centuries, which in Greece was the Iron Age, an important military development affected the social and with it the political structure of society. Greek infantry, based on the hoplite, the heavily armed and armored infantrymen organized into tight phalanxes, replaced the horsemen as the decisive force on the battlefield. The hoplite was a citizen soldier from the ranks of well to do farmers and the middle class who furnished his own sword, spear, helmet, and shield. His life and military success depended on teamwork within the phalanx, which fostered a spirit of egalitarianism, responsibility, and discipline. His predominance undermined the aristocratic primacy of an earlier period and fostered democratic concepts within the state and the military. As one historian put it, the phalanx was the school which made the Greek polis. William H. McNeill continues, the right to a voice in public affairs, formerly restricted to nobles, was broadened to include all citizens having the means to equip themselves as members of the phalanx. The hoplite franchise remained a conservative ideal for many Greek cities throughout the 5th century and later. This means that once again, citizenship was so defined so as, quite accidentally and probably at first unintentionally, to exclude women. If democracy was to be based on the concept of citizen soldier, then such exclusion seemed both inevitable and logical. Yet, Spartan society, similarly affected by the development of the hoplite phalanx, moved in the direction of suppressing all marks of inequality and difference and making of their society a garrison state of equals. The Spartan law, codified under Lycurgus in the 7th century, remained unchanged throughout Spartan history. It expressed the concept that the bearing of children was as important a service to the state as the service of the warrior, in a law which allowed the inscription of the name of the deceased on a tomb only of a man who had died at war and of a woman who had died in childbirth. Spartan women were occupied with gymnastics, household management, and child rearing, while the menial housework and the making of clothing were left to non Spartan women. All girl infants were reared to adulthood, but infanticide was practiced on weak and sickly male children. In Sparta, adultery was not as strictly prescribed as in Athenian society, and Spartan society emphasizing the need for healthy warriors was relatively indifferent to whether a child was born legitimately or not. In its sharp contrast in matters of sexual regulation and polity, Spartan society seemed to Greeks of other cities to represent a clear cut choice of direction, relative equality and high status for women, combined with oligarchy and unfreedom as against the strict regulation of women combined with democracy. This choice is reflected in the political thought of both Plato and Aristotle. In the Ionian city states, the development of commercial agriculture based on a lively trade in oil and wine to class division, as it gave rise to a wealthy middle class and an impoverished class of propertyless citizens and small farmers. Their discontent led in the 7th and 6th centuries to the establishment of tyrannies in many cities. For Athens, this indicated the need for corrective legislation, which would lessen class antagonism and thus safeguard the state. The laws of Draco and later of Solon of Athens, 640-635 to 560 BC, laid the foundation of democracy in the classical age. The class antagonisms and the insecurity of their class of poor farmers struggling to raise themselves to a middle class level was reflected in the misogynist poetry of Hesiod and Simonides in the 7th century BC. Hesiod, in his Works and Days, expressed the individualism of a poor man who no longer relies on his clan or tribe for protection, but expects by hard work and prudent management to increase his wealth. Restraint, self control, and competitiveness come to be seen as virtues in such an enterprise, while the pursuit of luxurious taste and sexual pleasures is a threat to the family economy. Hesiod's misogyny is both prescriptive and mythical. In his contrasting of the good wife who is chaste, hardworking, thrifty, and cheerful, and the bad wife, he set standards for the definition of gender by men of his class, his day. In his recasting of the mythological Paul, he places the blame on woman and her sexual nature for bringing evil into the world. Hesiod's theogony defines and elaborates the ascension of the storm god Zeus to the leading position in the Greek pantheon of gods. Certainly, Hesiod did not invent this myth of transformation, which is somewhat similar to the Mesopotamian myths we have discussed, in which male gods take over power from the forces of chaos identified with the fertility goddesses. Hesiod's theogony reflects a change in religious and gender concepts which had already taken place in Greek society. As described by Hesiod, the conflict between the gods is expressed in terms of male, female, and generational tension. In the In the earliest mythical period, the sky god Uranus, trying to prevent a challenge to his rule by his son, holds his children in Gaia's, the earth goddess's, womb. But Gaia and her son Kronos castrate Uranus and overthrow him. Now, Kronos, in his turn, fears that he will be overthrown by the sons his wife Rhea bears, and so he swallows them each. But Rhea hides her son Zeus in a cave protected by the earth goddess. When he is grown, Zeus fights and overthrows his father and ascends to power. To prevent his own overthrow, he swallows his wife, Metis, thus keeping her from bringing forth a son, and by this act assimilating into himself her power of procreating. Thus, Zeus himself can give birth to Athena, who springs full grown from his head. She comes to symbolize the forces of justice and order. We should note here not only the takeover of the male god, but his assumption of the power of procreativity, which is similar to the symbolic definitions we have discussed in Genesis. The force and importance of this symbolic downgrading of the mother is further elaborated in Aeschylus' The Furies, the last play in his Orestia trilogy. The Orestia has been interpreted by a number of critics as signifying the last defense of mother goddess power against patriarchy. The story concerns events following Aga- Agamemnon's sacrificial killing of his daughter Iphigenia, which propitiated the wind gods and allowed the Greek fleet to sail to Troy and victory. 10 years later, upon his return from Troy, Agamemnon, who has returned with the Trojan princess Cassandra, now his concubine and slave, is killed by his wife Clytemnestra in revenge for the death of Iphigenia. Clytemnestra's son, Orestes, regarding his mother's crime as an act of rebellion against the king, kills his mother, for which crime he is hounded by the Furies. To divert their anger, he argues that his action was justified and that they should have hounded his mother for her crime. The Furies excuse her action by asserting the primacy of mother right. The man she killed was not of her own blood. Orestes asks, but am I of my mother's? The Furies point out the obvious. Vile wretch, she nourished you in her own womb. Do you disown your mother's blood? The playwright lets Apollo settle the argument by asserting the claim of patriarchy. The mother is not the parent of the child, which is called hers. She is the nurse who tends the growth of young seed planted by its true parent, the male. Apollo appeals to the goddess Athena to further prove his point. She obliges, no mother gave me birth. Therefore, the father's claim and male supremacy in all things wins my whole heart's loyalty. It is Athena's deciding vote which frees Orestes and banishes the Furies, and with them the claims of the mother goddess. Yet, a female principle has to be pacified, so the Furies are given a sacred dwelling and will be worshipped as guardians of the laws. The doctrine of male procreativity reappears in its most developed form in the work of Aristotle. It is in this form that it had its determining and shaping influence on Western science and philosophy. Aristotle elevated the counterfactual account of the origin of human life from the level of myth to the level of science by grounding it in a broad ranging philosophical system. His theory of causation posited four factors that make a thing what it is. One, a material cause. Two, the efficient cause, that which gives it impetus. Three, a formal cause, that which gives it form. And four, the telos, the goal toward which it strives. In line with Greek philosophical thought, Aristotle considers matter of lower importance than spirit. In his explanation of the origin of human life, three or four factors are considered causes for being were attributed to the male's contribution to procreation. Semen. With only the fourth and lowest, the material being the woman's contribution, attributed any material component to the embryo, more divine. For the into being is male, is better and more divine than the material, whereby that life was created by the meeting of sperm and what he called catamenia, 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 the female discharge. However, he defined both sperm and catamenia as semen or seed, with the difference that catamenia are semen not in a pure state, but in need of working up. Aristotle completed the necessary how at every point in its explanatory system, it so happens that the female's endowment or contribution is inferior to that of the male. He further postulates that the male is active and the female is passive. If then the male stands for the effective and active, and the female considered as female for the passive, it follows that what the female would contribute to the semen of the male would not be semen, but material for the semen to work upon. This is just what we find to be the case, for the catamenia have in their nature an affinity to the primitive matter. Aristotle elaborated on the essential and important difference between the active male and the passive female sex. Without offering much evidence for his assertion, he explained that if it is the male that has the power of making the sensitive soul, it is impossible for the female to have the power of making the sensitive body. In a later analogy, he described the process as that of a craftsman making a bed from wood or a ball from wax. The craftsman, presumably being the male, the material substance being the female contribution. The historian Marianne Klein Horace, who has written an insightful feminist critique of Aristotle's work, comments that in Aristotle's view, the female passively takes on her task, laboring with her body to fulfill another's design and plan. The product of her labor is not hers. The man, on the other hand, does not labor but works. Aristotle implied that the male is homo faber, the maker who works upon inert material. His soul contributes the form theory, and without further explanation, assumed the inferiority of the female's biological equivalent. The female principle is responsible for the birth of monstrosities, and using this that the offspring should become female instead of male. This, however, is a natural necessity. Aristotle is even more explicit elsewhere. For just as the young of mutilated parents are sometimes born mutilated and sometimes not, so also the young born of a female are sometimes female and sometimes male instead. For the female is, as it were, a mutilated male, and the catamenia are semen, only not pure, for there is only one thing they have not in them, the principle of soul. These definitions of women as mutilated males, devoid of the principle of soul, are not isolated but rather permeate Aristotle's biological and philosophical work. He is quite consistent in reasoning that the biological inferiority of woman must make her inferior also in her capacities, her ability to reason, and therefore her ability to make decisions. From this follows Aristotle's definition of gender and its integration into his political thought. Aristotle's grand mental construct rests on a teleological foundation. The nature of a thing is its end. For what each thing is, when fully developed, we call its nature. Such a view predisposes the whatever nature of nature, and Aristotle's proof of this assertion lies in the fact that the individual, when isolated, is not self sufficient. In order to make the state function properly, it must be governed by justice, which is the principle of order in political society. The state is made up of households, and to understand properly the management of the state, one must understand the management of the household. The first and fewest possible parts of the family are master and slave, husband and wife, father and children. Aristotle then discusses the institution of slavery and describes it as controversial. Some people assert that it is contrary to nature and therefore unjust. Rule, others to be ruled. This is so because of what he sees as a natural dichotomy. The soul is by nature the ruler, the body the subject. Similarly, the mind rules the appetites. It is clear that the rule of the soul over the body and the mind and the rational element over passionate is natural and the female inferior, and the one extends to all mankind. The rule of men over animals is equally natural, not very different, for both with their bodies minister to the needs of life. It is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right. Aristotle pursues the logic of his argument by describing the different ways in which a husband rules over his slaves, his wife, and his children, the difference being dependent on the nature of the persons to be ruled. For the slave has no deliberative faculty at all. The woman has, but it is without authority, and the child has, but it is immature. Similarly, their moral virtue is different. The courage of a man is shown in commanding, of a woman in obeying. Aristotle's soul rules over body, rational thought over emotion, humans over animals, male over female, masters over slaves, and Greeks over barbarians. All the philosopher needs to do to justify the existing class relations within his society is to show how each of the subordinate groups is by nature designed to occupy its appropriate rank in the hierarchy. He has some difficulty doing this in the case of slaves and finds the need to justify their subordination and explain why it is just. That is so because even at the height of the democratic Athenian state, slavery as an institution was still controversial enough to be questioned. Even some who assume that enslaving captive peoples is justified by law, says Aristotle, then question whether this can be justified in case of an unjust war. The philosopher admits that there is some foundation for this difference of opinion, but there is no difference of opinion regarding the inferiority of women. And so Aristotle uses the metaphor of the marital relationship to justify the master's dominance over the slave. Since the former appears natural, that is uncontroversial and therefore just, it can make the latter acceptable. Human society is divided into two sexes: the male, rational, strong, endowed with the capacity for procreation, equipped with soul, and fit to rule; the female, passionate and unable to control her appetites, weak, providing only low matter for the process of procreation, devoid of soul, and designed to be ruled. And because this is so, the rule of some men over other men can be justified by ascribing to those men some of the same qualities ascribed to the female. Aristotle does just that. Slaves, with their bodies, minister to the needs of life, so do women. Slaves participate in rational principle enough to apprehend, but not to have such a principle, so do women. Thus, Aristotle justifies class dominance logically from his gender definitions. The fact that sex dominance antedates class dominance and lies at its foundation is both implicit and explicit in Aristotle's philosophy. It is implicit in his choice of explanatory metaphors, which takes for granted that his audience will understand the naturalness of male dominance over females and consider slavery just if he can prove his analogy. It is explicit in the way he sets up his dichotomies and assigns greater value to that which men do, politics, philosophy, rational discourse, than that which women do, minister to the needs of life. And it is most explicit of all in the way his gender definitions and prescriptions are built into his discourse on politics. His great and path breaking insight that man is by nature a political animal is immediately followed by his explanation that the state is made up of individual households and that the management of the household is analogous and makes a model for the management of the body politic. What he describes here is exactly the development we have been tracing in Mesopotamic society since its inception. The patriarchal family is the form which the archaic state takes. The patriarchal family is the cell out of which the larger body of patriarchal dominance arises. Sexual dominance underlies class and race dominance. Aristotle's grand and daring explanatory system Aristotle's grand and daring explanatory system, which encompasses and transcended most of the knowledge then available in his society, incorporated the patriarchal gender concept of the inferiority of women in such a way as to make it indisputable and, in fact, invisible. Definitions of class, of private property, of scientific explanations could and would be debated for centuries on the basis of Aristotle's thought. But male supremacy and male dominance are here a basic foundation of the philosopher's thought and are thus elevated to the power of natural laws. In Book 5 of the Republic, Plato, in the voice of Socrates, sets down the conditions for the training of the guardians, his elite leadership group. Socrates proposes that women should have the same opportunity as men to be trained as guardians. In support of this, he offers a strong statement against making sex differences the basis for discrimination. If the difference between men and women consists only in women bearing and men begetting children, This does not amount to proof that a woman differs from a man in respect to the sort of education she should receive, and we shall therefore continue to maintain that our guardians and their wives ought to have the same pursuits. Socrates proposes the same education for boys and girls, freeing guardian women from housework and childcare. But this female equality of opportunity will serve a larger purpose: the destruction of the family. Plato's aim is to abolish private property, the private family, and with it self interest in his leadership group, for he sees clearly that private property engenders class antagonism and disharmony. Therefore, men and women are to have a common way of life, common education, common children, and they are to watch over the citizens in common. In his philosophical writings, Aristotle accepted the body versus soul dualism of Plato, as well as his concept of the natural inequality of human beings as the justice of the stronger governing the weak. But he was not in the least affected by Plato's or Socrates' ideas concerning women. Had he acknowledged Plato's ideas on the subject and aimed to refute them, his dicta on women would carry less prescriptive force. Yet, in a sense, his bypassing of Plato's ideas is quite justified, for Aristotle was writing about the state and about class and gender relations as they actually existed. Plato envisioned women as equals only in terms of a utopian state, a benevolent dictatorship of the guardians. Among a carefully selected and bred elite, some women might function as equals. In the democratic polis based on slavery, about which Aristotle was writing, the very definition of citizenship had to exclude all those deemed inferior: helots, slaves, women. Thus, Aristotle's political science institutionalizes and rationalizes the exclusion of women from political citizenship as the very foundation of the democratic polity. It is this heritage, not the utopian thought of Plato, which Western civilization would use for centuries in its science, its philosophy, and its gender doctrine. By the time men began symbolically to order the universe and the relationship of humans to God in major explanatory systems, the subordination of women had become so completely accepted that it appeared natural both to men and women. As a result of this historic development, the major metaphors and symbols of Western civilization incorporated the assumption of female subordination and inferiority. With the Bible's fallen Eve and Aristotle's woman as mutilated male, we see the emergence of two symbolic constructs which assert and assume the existence of two kinds of human beings: the male and the female, different in their essence, their function, and their potential. This metaphoric construct, the inferior and not quite completed female, became embedded in every major explanatory system in such a way as to take on the life and force of actuality. On the unexamined assumption that this stereotype represented reality, institutions denied women equal rights and access to privileges. Educational deprivation for women became justified, and given the sanctity of tradition and patriarchal dominance for millennia, appeared justified and natural. For patriarchally organized society, this symbolic construct represented an essential ingredient in the order and structure of civilization. The significance of this development for women is hard to overestimate. We will address some of its consequences in the second volume, when we will explore and discuss the way in which the hidden assumption of female inferiority and male dominance in the philosophies of Western civilization impeded women's ability to understand their own situation and to remedy it. But we should Note, in summary, the way in which inequality among men and women was built not only into the language, thought, and philosophy of Western civilization, but the way in which gender itself became a metaphor defining power relations in such a way as to mystify them and render them invisible. I'm sorry, there was actually one last chapter, that's chapter 11, the creation of patriarchy. And I just want to go ahead and get this on over with. So, chapter 11. Patriarchy is a historic creation formed by men and women in a process which took nearly 2,500 years to its completion. In its earliest form of patriarchy appeared as the archaic state. The basic unit of its organization was the patriarchal family, which both expressed and constantly generated its rules and values. We have seen how integrally definitions of gender affected the formation of the state. Let us briefly review the way in which gender became created, defined, and established. The roles and behavior deemed appropriate to the sexes were expressed in values, customs, laws, and social roles. They also, and very importantly, were expressed in leading metaphors, which became part of the cultural construct and explanatory system. The sexuality of women, consisting of their sexual and their reproductive capacities and services, was commodified even prior to the creation of Western civilization. The development of agriculture in the Neolithic period fostered the intertribal exchange of women, not only as a means of avoiding incessant warfare by the cementing of marriage alliances, but also because societies with more women could produce more children. In contrast to the economic needs of hunting gathering societies, agriculturalists could use the labor of children to increase production and accumulate surpluses. Men as a group had rights in women, which women as a group did not have in men. Women themselves became a resource acquired by men, much as the land was acquired by men. Women were exchanged or bought in marriages for the benefit of their families. Later, they were conquered or bought in slavery, where their sexual services were part of their labor and where their children were the property of their masters. In every known society, it was women of conquered tribes who were first enslaved, whereas men were killed. It was only after men had learned how to enslave the women of groups who could be defined as strangers that they learned how to enslave men of those groups and later subordinates from within their own societies. Thus, the enslavement of women combining both racism and sexism preceded the formation of classes and class oppression. Class differences were, at their very beginnings, expressed and constituted in terms of patriarchal relations. Class is not a separate construct from gender, rather, class is expressed in genderic terms. By the second millennium BC in Mesopotamian societies, the daughters of the poor were sold into marriage or prostitution in order to advance the economic interest of their families. The daughters of men of property could command a bride price paid by the family of the groom to the family of the bride, which frequently enabled the bride's family to secure more financial advantages than the groom's family.